So our next speaker, Stuart, is a dear friend, like Honor, and we've been collaborators on many interesting projects. All of us, I think, value the importance of thinking about and planning for the future. And Stuart now does this work in both Toronto and Chicago, right?
Right.
Yes. Okay, good. So now we've established communications as well. Excellent. So Stuart, they've all read your bio, so I'm not going to do long introductions on that front. We're interested to hear what your ideas are about a museum of the future, and particularly what the connections might be to this whole notion of East and West, and how we might move beyond it. So, Perfect. Stuart Candy, everyone.
Thank you, Aaron. Hi, everyone. Well, look, it's a pleasure to almost be with you. I'm sorry I couldn't make the journey that far east, or is it west, from Chicago. But so as Aaron sort of suggested, my lot in life is to be an experiential futurist. So what I do is help clients and audiences and my students all over the world to think about possible futures by making them tangible as physical artifacts and immersive experiences. So what I want to show you is a set of tangible hypotheticals. I've been mildly disobedient, and I have 4 to share with you, because the future is plural, and so the artifacts need to be as well. So next slide.
I'm shocked.
All right, so this is the first of the artifacts, and this unassuming item is a wristband from the year 2030, created by my students as part of an immersive environment set in 2030. Students at Ontario College of Art and Design. And the experiential scenario that they were staging in this case was, what if yoga as a practice becomes even more corporatized? Next slide. So in this practice called Namaste, each yogic pose is sponsored by a different company and indeed named after a different product. Like the Google Mountain pose or the Microsoft Surface table pose. And this little artifact, the Namaste wristband, monitors not just one's body while one is practicing this yoga, but one's mind, the degree of focus on the brand in question for each of those poses, in a metric which is described in this scenario as brandfulness. So if this isn't making your skin crawl just a little bit, then perhaps the artifact isn't working the way it is supposed to. But I think the relationship between East and West that this particular object seems to suggest is one in which a Western and certainly corporate cultural appropriation of the Ayurvedic practice of yoga is really turned up to 110%. Now, this is not a prediction. This is important to note. This is an exploration. So we're not stuck with this. This object does not necessarily belong in a museum of the future in 2050, but in a possible museum exhibit for 2030 along the way. Next slide. And next slide. There you can see the Google Mountain pose. Next slide. Now, the second object to present for your consideration is called the Nature Pod. This is based on the idea that with over 50% of humanity now living in cities, the reality for most people day to day is increasingly that they do not get exposed, do not get to experience what we would traditionally call nature on any given day. So this is, next slide, this is an imaginary product from the year 2021. NaturePod attempts to solve all of that lack of exposure to nature by making it possible through immersing in a virtual environment for 10 minutes per day without leaving your building, perhaps without even leaving your cubicle, to lower your stress levels, lower your cortisol levels, and raise your productivity and creativity. Next slide, please. So this is a project. You can see these people kind of lying prone in these little NaturePod units. This is a project by my lab, the Situation Lab, and 4 of my students from OCAD University. And we launched it with the support of Interface, the largest carpet tile company in the world, as an exploration of biophilic design and the direction in which the imitation of natural environments is taking inside architectural practice. But we launched this at the biggest architecture and interior design trade show in Canada, as if it were a real product. at the end of last year. And so the east-west connection here, it can be seen in this notion that actually this is a sort of late industrial interpretation of a Japanese practice, shirin-yoku, or forest bathing. But what it seems to point to is neither specifically Eastern nor Western in character, but sort of a shared challenge, because urbanization being a global phenomenon and something that we're all going to have to deal with, it seems perhaps, and to echo a comment that was made by Honor about our relationship to nature being simulated and mediated through technology, perhaps this is a direction that our collective values are turning. Of the hundreds of people who tried this at the Buildings Show last year, to our surprise, about 90% of them really liked it. And had we really been selling it, we could have sold a bunch of units. So next slide, please. And final. Sorry, next slide. All right, so to the third of the artifacts, and this is a monument which poses the question, what becomes of Chinatowns in a world where China is the geopolitical superpower rather than the United States? So this comes from a period when I lived in Hawaii for 4 years as a postgraduate student, working with a colleague there named Jake Dunnigan. I was also a fellow at the East-West Center, of all places, during that time. And what we were seeking to do was to create an experience in the neighborhood of Chinatown, Honolulu, about its own future. So what you're seeing here is an artist's rendering of a gift from the Chinese government to the people of Hawaii at some point in the 2020s. And what it is a picture of Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese revolutionary who actually went to high school in Honolulu, and Queen Liliuokalani, the last Hawaiian monarch, who was overthrown by the United States in 1893. So these people were not actually contemporaries, but in this kind of mythic temporality, this is a gift from the Chinese government to the people of Hawaii saying, hey, how about it? How about it? So what this is a geopolitical story. This is a story about the changing balance of power from one part of the world to the other, with kind of Hawaii serving as a fulcrum in between. And another possible museum piece. Next slide, please. So we installed this and showed it all around Chinatown to kind of foment a conversation about the neighborhood's possible futures among its residents and business people. Next slide. And we also created souvenirs of this object, which we imagined would possibly be, in this future, quite a significant tourist attraction. Sorry, next slide, please. Just skipped over one, but you'll see, there was a previous slide which was some magnets, souvenir magnets showing the Statue of Harmony, which is what it says in Chinese and Hawaiian on the plinth. There it is. And those were dropped into souvenir stores in Honolulu's Chinatown. 2 slides on, please. Okay, so this is the final artifact from a museum of possible futures. And this comes also from the Hawaii period, although it was a project that Jake and I carried out at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. The question that this project poses was, what if Hawaii closed its gates to the outside world for most of the 21st century in a deliberate effort to return to self-sufficiency and cut off supply chains from the outside world? Next slide, please. So if this were to happen, this is just one artifact of many, but this is the exhibition is set in the year 2108, looking back on a century during which nobody came in and nobody left. And of course, part of that question, what if it's closed its doors, leads to another question, which is what becomes of the installed base of industrial and material artifacts that surround us in this sort of late modern period. It doesn't just evaporate, right? So what we see here is a hubcap from a Nissan vehicle, which has been repurposed into a wok. So, because of course a car that can no longer be driven is not particularly useful to anyone, so it's been salvaged and turned to another, perhaps more basic cultural purpose. Now, there's a few layers here, but I want to finish by just observing that I think this last artifact perhaps is the clearest example of a principle which runs through all four, which is best captured, to my mind, by a statement of the science fiction writer Bruce Sterling, which is tomorrow composts today. Tomorrow composts today. So these 3 or 4 artifacts each kind of embody a different notion of how, I don't want to call it the distinction, but the relationship between East and West as ideas could unfold. And I think the compost that we're talking about here is an invitation to think of these things less as categorical trajectories than as a sort of nutritive mulch of influences that can give seed and root to any number of future possibilities. Final slide, please. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Stuart.